can be found at counteringcrime.org under the Events tab, as well as on the Alliance to Counter Crime Online's YouTube channel. Also note that the fourth and final event of the series, which will focus specifically on reform proposals, will take place on Tuesday, June 29th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Today's discussion is entitled Tech Possibilities, Reshaping a Misinformed Debate. Those of you who saw the first panel will know the extent to which the original internet legislation, including Section 230, was shaped by the technology background prevailing at the time. Today's technological capabilities will also inevitably shape and inform any policy changes. And of course, not only are we a long way from 1996, but there are also various misleading narratives out there today, as well as a lot of questions and confusion about the state of current technology and how that might affect policy. These are the questions we will be exploring today, including how existing technologies and coding practices could restrict a wide range of illicit online content, and whether addressing illicit content online is a policy question or a technical one. To do so, we have assembled a great panel featuring Tom Galvin of the Digital Citizens Alliance, Gretchen Peters from the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, and Dr. Tim Mackey, head of the Global Health Policy Institute at the University of California, San Diego. First, we'll hear from each of the speakers, and then we'll go to Q&A. You can send messages via chat at any time or questions if you're on Zoom. And if you're watching via live stream on YouTube, you can tweet your questions to @counteringcrime, and we will receive the questions. So let's begin with our panel. The first speaker is Dr. Tim Mackey, head of the Global Health Policy Institute at the University of California, San Diego. Tim has pioneered the development of machine learning tools able to flag traffickers, drug dealers, wildlife criminals, and other illicit actors in vast troves of social media data. He'll be discussing his work related to opioids and COVID fraud, and talking about tech solutions that work to reduce and restrict criminal actors. Tim, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Julius, and thanks to ACCO and all the organizers for the invitation to talk today. I'm going to share my screen so I can provide some slides to illustrate some of the work that we're doing and some of the possibilities here to use tech to combat a lot of this illegal activity online. So just as a quick start, I'm originally a researcher, professor at UC San Diego, but back about 4 years ago, we had published research and the NIH came to us and asked us to translate that research into innovation, specifically in relation to the opioid pandemic, the opioid national public health emergency we're dealing with. So we're in the process of translating that research through a grant from the National Institutes of Health. And so the federal taxpayer is basically paying for a lot of the innovation that we're doing to protect people online. Generally what we do is we do big data surveillance on multiple social media platforms, internet sites, and other digital sources, including the dark web. And when you pull in a lot of that data, a high volume of unstructured data, you have to use different approaches in machine learning, natural language processing, topic modeling to identify content that is illegal. And then, of course, you have to look at that data and ask yourself, what are the characteristics of risk associated with that? And a lot of times they're going to be different, whether they be related to opioids, COVID-19, the pandemic itself, or other health-related issues. And then the most important thing, of course, is to translate that intelligence into something that someone can use. And so we are working with different federal agencies like the DEA, the FDA, and other partners to try to operationalize this intelligence to make some impact in the digital space. So as a global public health professor at UCSD, I spent most of my last year and a half working on COVID-related studies. But one of the areas we looked at very early, which Tom will also talk about some of his work that he did in this space as well, is looking at fake COVID products being sold online. So there are a host of different fake products being sold on multiple social media platforms, multiple parts of the internet. And if you were a fraudster, this was your time to go out there and get business. So we did an early study where we looked at the Instagram and Twitter platforms to see if we could find illicit product being sold online. And at that time, it was a time where there weren't testing kits available. So there was a lot of fraud around that space as well. But interesting about social media is it also enables influencers to peddle fake products as well. So this was someone we found in our outlier analysis who had a large number of followers, and we're trying to figure out who this person is. And turned out to be a celebrity medical professional who had a link to fake testing kits. And we provided this information to the FDA, and we're not sure if they acted upon it, but essentially that's one of the other things that social media enables to do, is to make this content viral. And this medical professional was sharing it with millions of followers. And so most of the things that we do then, of course, are building these dashboards to display the data geospatially, also talking about which users are out there. Again, this is all public information, people publicly posting their comments and their advertisements of these fake products. And most of the work we've been doing before that was in the opioid space. So unfortunately, with COVID, the opioid epidemic is being exacerbated by a lot of the things that we're dealing with, like social isolation, mental health issues, the fact that we're online more time. So right now, we're going back to a lot of the original work that we did in the opioid space, where essentially you can find all types of drugs, whether they be prescription controlled substances, drugs that are illicit, of course, and then drugs that drug dealers don't even tell you what they're selling, but you just trust the drug dealer that they can get you the high they want. So you have a lot of different categories of drugs here as well. And we've had a lot of studies, and similarly, we're building these same dashboards. And then the last thing I'll just highlight is some of the work that we've been doing in collaboration with the DEA, where their focus has somewhat been on, the fentanyl crisis. The fact that we have so many people dying from counterfeit fentanyl laced in other products. And so we've been looking at different distribution networks across China, for example, where Chinese language sellers may then surface their content up on US platforms. And then, these products, of course, proliferate all across the internet. So this is just one example of searching for some common contact information, and it leads you to a lot of fentanyl precursors being sold online. So in the sake of time, I'll end it there and just note that we've had a lot of collaborations that have been good, and we're hoping to continue to translate this research into something that's actionable and something that can protect the American public. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Tim, our next speaker is Tom Galvin, who is Executive Director of the Digital Citizens Alliance and has been active in internet security and safety issues for more than a decade. Tom's group conducts pioneering research into how criminals operate online and, critically, how tech algorithms amplify and spread illicit content. Tom, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm guessing you can hear me. I just want to make sure the muting worked. Right, we're good? Great. Thank you again for the invitation. Given all that's going on in Congress, the DOJ, and the states, it's a very timely conversation. And while across that spectrum, there's a lot of moving parts and perspectives, it really comes down to one thing. What type of society do we want to have? There's a parable about boiling a frog. I don't know if any of you have heard it, but the parable is that if you put a frog in scalding water, it will immediately jump out. But if you put a frog in lukewarm water and then slowly raise the temperature, ultimately they won't notice and they're boiled to death. Over the last 20 years, these technological changes that have occurred with platforms, many Americans haven't realized the implications of those. They've occurred gradually, and we haven't necessarily noticed the implications of it. And now we have to reconcile what's occurred with what we think is right. And DCA has been looking at these issues for over 8 years, and in the course of it has raised the alarms on numerous issues, from marketing and sale of dangerous drugs, counterfeits, hate speech, jihadists, for example, using Google Plus almost as an empty warehouse, abandoned warehouse, and domestic extremism. Today, I just want to offer some quick perspectives on what we've seen and talk a little bit about the solutions that are being discussed. So I'll go through some slides. Fundamentally, though, our online world is out of balance, in part because there's been a lack of accountability. And that lack of accountability has led to a warping of our platforms. I won't dwell on all these because we've heard it a little bit from Tim, but what we saw was platforms being utilized to be able to prey on Americans' fears, particularly early with fake vaccines, with the counterfeit sales of products. So we've seen this across the board, and despite claims by the platforms that they would do something about it, it still ended up happening. And that is fundamentally a business model issue, because if you think about it, we've heard Facebook go on apology tours for years. And if they're legitimate about that and it keeps happening, that says something fundamental about the business model, that it's built into the business model for these things to have to happen. So moving on from that. So recently, and we just put out a report on this in April, we saw domestic extremism flourish. For those who have followed what's occurred with militias, and you go back to the 1990s with Ruby Ridge and the Oklahoma City bombing, you saw a lot of domestic extremism. It seemed to slow down a little bit right after 9/11 as everyone's focus shifted, but it reemerged in the last decade in many respects in the same way that jihadists have used the platforms to spread propaganda and recruit. We saw that over the last several years on digital platforms, and that culminated with the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So along the way, there was a lot of warnings, but again, the business model of digital platforms made it frankly contrary in a way for them to be able to control that. And it led us to a really extreme situation that we're all dealing with now. We have seen the sale of dangerous drugs on Facebook and Google for a decade, whether that's both opioids, steroids, counterfeits. We regularly buy and test drugs, particularly on the medical side, and very often those drugs end up not being real. For example, steroids and HGH is very rarely real when purchased online. And I'll flip through the next slide. So along these years, the digital platforms have ignored warnings from many people, not just digital citizens, but many people. And now we are seeing the implications, and they are paying the price of that. We did some polling, and I'm going to caveat these numbers. The poll is largely done, so they may go up or down a percentage or two, but the themes won't change. 66% of Americans report their trust in platforms has decreased in the last year. And by more than 2-to-1 margin, they don't view these companies as responsible. And that has serious issues for the health of the internet, given how important they are to the fabric of our society and what runs through them. So there's a lot of solutions being discussed out there, and I'll just touch on a few of them as we go through. So we know that the issue of Section 230 has been out there, and we know, if you just look at what occurred on Capitol Hill yesterday, there's efforts to do antitrust in Congress. We know that the Department of Justice has launched investigations and has actually a trial date. You have nearly every state AG doing that as well, with the trial date of next year. And Americans are grappling with what to do with this. So what should they do with the power of these? You see it. There's a split about whether or not they should be broken up, leave them alone, or in a lot, we're not sure. And I would argue we're in the beginning or middle of a discussion about what our future should look like, a societal future, and the way platforms should play a role in that. So there is widespread support for changes to make platforms accountable for content. You see the numbers here. Should they be responsible for the content on their sites? You have an overwhelming more than 4-to-1 number there. That is a significant number. And if you're familiar with polling, and you know sometimes on these issues can be complicated, you get numbers that are a little mixed. This is a significant number and demonstrates the widespread public concern about what we're confronting right now. And this is pretty much of an eye chart slide, so my apologies for that. But this is culminated in almost every state AG and the Department of Justice engaging on both anti-competitive behavior, ad tech, where you have Google both buying ads, selling ads, and being essentially the exchange, and this issue of search monopoly and its impact on innovation. This is part of the public debate about what the future of platforms should look like. And as we say, it's not only being held in Congress and the Department of Justice, but at the states and in the EU. And this is where we're at. So what are the potential solutions? Something Digital Citizens has talked about for a while, and this is more of a industry thing, is the casino model. Anyone who knows anything about gambling, if you're a card shark and you're going and cheat and you do it in Nevada and you get kicked out, you're going to learn about it in every other state because they collaborate. We have not seen that type of collaboration despite years of calling for it. And I can say years because I've called for it for years. And you now have a wide group of Americans who believe they should be doing more to collaborate and identify. We may be too late for that, by the way. We have had this evolution of business, the platforms have to do better, to the platforms better do better, or someone's going to make them. And now I think we're at a stage where we're going to see changes in the law and even potential regulatory or structural breakups of them that is now being discussed. So I started with the frog getting boiled, right? That is what's occurred. It occurred slow, but now we have to decide what type of society we want. What is the role of digital platforms in that society? And the conversations like this are critical to it because we have to get this right. So I really appreciate the time today, and I look forward to questions later on.
Thank you very much, Tom. Our final speaker is Gretchen Peters, co-founder of the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. ACCO brings together 40 members from around the globe who track illicit content ranging from illegal drug sales to wildlife crime and human trafficking to various types of fraud. Gretchen has testified on these problems 3 times in Congress and supported the Department of Justice in developing new policy towards online crime. Gretchen?
Thank you, Julius, so much for moderating today. Section 230 was designed in part to protect freedom of expression, something all Americans hold dear. At the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, we believe the law should be revised to clarify the difference between speech and conduct. Selling fentanyl pills on Snapchat does not magically become free speech just because it occurs on social media. Stalking is not free speech if it occurs in cyberspace. And selling people for sex or other forced labor is not free expression. It's a felony. If it's illegal to do something in real life, it should be illegal for tech platforms to host that activity online, and especially to amplify it. And that's something that Tom's surveys have found a majority of Americans on both sides of the political aisle agree with. Restricting and responding to illicit activity is not just a matter of building better artificial intelligence, as the tech industry would have you believe. That may be one tool in the toolkit, but it's not a strategy. We believe that tech companies should be required by law to implement safety features into their systems design and to have those designs approved prior to releasing products for public use. Try and imagine any other industry allowed to release whatever product it develops without implementing safety into its designs. Think about automobiles, airplanes, medical devices. And yet we allow the tech industry to release and keep on the market products that have clearly identified safety flaws. This move fast, break things culture must come to an end. Enough has been broken. The House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Consumer Protection is working on the Online Consumer Protection Act that would require tech platforms to, 1, have their terms of service approved by the Federal Trade Commission, 2, to make those terms transparent to users, and 3, it would cause platforms to lose their 230 protections in the event they failed to enforce those terms. This is a really good plan, and it doesn't force a one-size-fits-all regulatory regime on all platforms that might stifle innovation. To reach a balance between freedom and safety, system design is critical. Some compromises are going to have to be made, and the best designed systems will have maximum transparency and accountability built in. I'll provide you some examples of what I mean by systems design, but let me start with this simple fact. Computer code is just ones and zeros. What we code systems to do is up to us. It's a mathematical problem, but policies and laws should set the framework. Right now, the internet permits a great deal of anonymity. It's pretty easy to establish an avatar on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, or a host of other platforms. And I know that because my members at ACCO operate dozens of fake profiles to conduct our research into illegal conduct. There are valid reasons for people to be able to operate anonymously online. Take, for example, a political dissident in an authoritarian country. But there are also negative reasons for avatars, such as bots that spread disinformation or scammers who steal other people's identities. Defining the difference is a matter of policy, not technology. People are creatures of habit. We engage in repetitive and often predictable behavior. Tech firms can, and already do, develop typologies that model how users behave. A typical grandparent who uses Facebook to share pictures of their family and pets and communicate with friends exhibits a very different pattern and distinct data usage from a drug dealer selling oxycodone. Moderation systems could be designed to flag for closer scrutiny the users that exhibit patterns indicating illicit activity could be occurring. Groups, especially private and secret groups, are already an epicenter of illicit activity on Facebook, and there are also problems on cloud-based storage systems like Dropbox and Amazon Cloud. There are multiple policy responses that technology can support. It's not feasible nor desirable to have moderators screen every bit of content that people upload. But what about a policy to require that group administrators, especially for private and secret groups, undergo an application process that involves verifying the reason for that group and their identity to the tech platform and agreeing to greater scrutiny? Again, machine learning tools can be built to scan for suspicious patterns of behavior in groups without inserting the prying eyes of law enforcement into everybody's Dropbox account. Tech companies are already required to report to law enforcement of any illicit activity related to child sex abuse. This requirement could be extended to illicit drug sales and other serious crime activity. Tech firms could be regulated to have to search for, remove, and report serious crime content instead of just being forced to report when they become aware, as is currently the case with child sex abuse content. These are, again, matters of policy, not technology. The technology exists. I want to point out an irony here. Whenever I give a talk like this and say that we at ACCO want to incentivize data sharing between tech firms and law enforcement, I get a flood of tech bros on social media claiming that I am trying to turn the internet into an FBI dragnet. What I want lawmakers and the American people to understand is that social media today already is a surveillance dragnet, but it's not the FBI that's watching your every move. It's Facebook, it's Google. Tech firms are much more intrusive than any government ever dreamed of being. At ACCO, we are fighting to keep ordinary people, and especially children, safer online, not to establish a world where governments read everybody's SMS messages. Recent court rulings pertaining to Google and Snapchat show that courts are starting to recognize the role that AI tools play in amplifying harm. This week's ruling out of the Ninth Circuit actually called on Congress to amend Section 230, saying the law, quote, shelters more activity than Congress envisioned it would, unquote. That's because algorithmic amplification is not passive hosting. It's an active form of distribution that should not be liability-free. In one recent ACCO study, Facebook's recommendation tools led us to about a third of the illicit content we found. We've had a similar feedback loop in research we've done on drugs, scams, and weapons. Facebook knows this too. Their own internal studies have found, for example, that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to their own recommendation tools. These AI tools can be modified and dialed back for certain content. Again, what is needed is transparency. Regulations could require tech firms to submit to safety testing of their new AI tools, just the way automobile firms have to have brake and airbag systems approved before they release them. Social media platforms and search engines can also shut off search results for certain word combinations, such as buy Oxy online, or they can insert a pop-up message, perhaps offering mental or substance abuse support, or warning that such activity will cause the user to be reported to the police. Again, this is all technically possible. It doesn't take fancy AI. This is basic if code. You can't buy a cup of coffee in this country without a label warning you that it could be hot. Yet we allow our children to navigate a treacherous landscape on Snapchat and Instagram without requiring warning messages about the dangers of lethal fentanyl pills or child predators. Then there's the question of encryption. Again, the debate here is totally misinformed. Encryption, like other coding, is math, and how encrypted systems are designed should be defined by common sense and public policy. Encrypted systems can be regulated so that there are defined occasions in which a tech firm must allow law enforcement to see what's going on. And the process for this occurring should be transparent, involving a court subpoena or an independently appointed committee. ACCO is currently planning a series of working groups that will address the ethical, legal, and technical challenges to all the issues I've raised today. And we look forward to working with lawmakers and tech firms to develop policies towards systems design that prioritize safety and the rule of law over profit. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Gretchen, and thank you to all the panelists. We'll now move on to Q&A, and just a reminder, you can send your questions through the chat feature if you are on the Zoom, and if you're watching via the live stream, you can tweet your questions to @counteringcrime, and we'll take your questions from there. The first question we have so far goes primarily to Tim, but perhaps everyone could chime in on it if you're so inclined. Tim, you mentioned that the US government has been doing the majority of funding to keep people safe online. Why do you think that is? And what do you think stops big tech from implementing technology like what your team uses?
Great question. So we have had the experience where the government has prioritized combating the opioid epidemic, and I think that's not an area that all companies are taking responsibility over. In fact, I think most companies want to kind of distribute that responsibility, whether it be the opioid manufacturers who are involved in multi-state litigation and are trying to fight against, Department of Justice and other type of claims from state AGs when it comes to their liability. There's a lot of people that don't think, a lot of platforms that also don't think that they're the cause of the problem. They think that we have a multifaceted opioid epidemic going on, which is the case. But the problem is that these platforms have facilitated substance use disorder, but they're not being implicated in the same way as a manufacturer would when they're marketing drugs to physicians to overprescribe. So in that case, when you have this public safety issue, a lot of times, if there's no legal mandate to do something about it, or there is a potential, gap in, actual liability or your compliance regulation, then companies may not be, encouraged to do so. So I think that's one of the conversations we're having here is what's the appropriate incentive for companies to do the right thing when, in fact, the platforms do facilitate this activity. And during COVID, it's probably getting worse because people are online more. So that's why, unfortunately, a lot of times the government has to step in and try to catalyze this type of research or catalyze this type of innovation because the private sector or other stakeholders are not meeting that need.
Julius, I'd like to chime in here as well. If I could.
Gretchen, we'll get to that, but there was just one follow-up from the audience that I want to pose to Tim very quickly, which is anyone using Tim's, I assume they mean any company using Tim's technology, and if so, who?
Yeah, so we do have a few companies that are starting to use the technology. One is actually Snapchat is starting to engage with us more proactive than other companies. And then we do have some other use cases that are more for public health related areas, such as assessing adherence to HIV drugs and looking at vaccine confidence. And those contracts are actually with the US FDA. So we have a mix of stakeholders that are kind of starting to get engaged in this space. There's different motivations, of course, with these different actors, but overall, I think one of the comments that was really important for me to kind of talk about is that these platforms don't seem to coordinate with each other too much. So even if you knock out some drug dealers on one platform, or one platform is progressive, then those drug dealers still populate in other spaces. So until there's some coordination across industry, you're going to have kind of a whack-a-mole situation. And unfortunately, there are competitive issues between these companies, of course. There are different parameters of the platforms, but the base technology of using machine learning and detecting drug dealers, because they're advertising their services, is pretty much the same. So I think until there's some coordination across the industry, it's going to be really hard to tackle this issue in a holistic fashion.
Go ahead, Gretchen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that to reiterate something that Tim has said and to expand on it a bit, which is that the current system doesn't incentivize tech firms to do anything about this problem. We are seeing increased activity as a result of the media and other attention that has come to these issues. But there are going to need to be both negative and positive incentives to tech firms to help develop better, to incentivize them to develop better technologies and policies. I'm talking a carrot and stick approach. Fines and loss of immunity if they don't do the right thing, and potentially subsidies or other positive, tax breaks if they do work to develop and share technologies that scan for illicit actors. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the presentation today was some of the numbers that Tom produced about the overwhelming support by the American people to address these problems on social media platforms. People are legitimately concerned about it, and I think we're at a really good time to make these reforms happen.
Tom, I'm not sure if you'd like to weigh in on this question, since you specifically mentioned how a failure to deal with these issues was sort of baked into the platform's business model. But in addition to commenting on that, if you'd like to, we had another question for you on your polling numbers, asking, have we seen a similar shift in public opinion in other countries in addition to the United States?
Yeah, I would love to, I will answer that, but I'd like just to go back to reinforce, I think Tim and Gretchen made some great points on collaboration and incentive. Gretchen mentioned that it's not realistic to review, for platforms to review all content, and that would be an unrealistic expectation by anyone. But it goes so far beyond that. When we used to do searches on Google for buy Oxy, it would autocomplete without a prescription. That's a decision on their part on the algorithm. We would search for stolen passports or counterfeit passports, and there would be an advertisement next to it which would say, need an immigration lawyer? So they were connecting, because their algorithm is so good, they could connect the video on YouTube or the search with the advertising they were doing. We have multiple times, and we've seen this across drugs, we saw it with jihad and domestic terrorism. When you search for something on Facebook, sooner or later, Facebook starts searching for you. So if you're searching for drugs, sooner or later, they're offering you things. So the algorithm is built in. It's not a question of whether they can look at all the content. They can't. But what they could do, for example, is flag content. If there's a YouTube video that says buy Oxy without a prescription, there's nothing wrong with flagging that piece of content for someone else to do more of a personal human review. It may end up being an NBC News story about people buying Oxy, and that gets passed on, or it might end up being a drug dealer trying to market drugs on YouTube, and we find that quite often. There are ways they can do it. More or less, they don't want to, because then they see it as camel's nose under the tent, and that's why they fought everything, including the sex trafficking provisions that were there. We know there was a lot of discord within the Internet Association among their members about what they should or shouldn't do there, and it caused pretty much a fracturing. All of this comes down to, they tend to treat these issues like PR problems, not public safety issues or internet security issues, or I would even go back to national security issues if you look at domestic extremism and jihad. It's a fundamental mind shift that needs to take place. And Julius, it starts with what you're getting at, which is the platforms are based on having the highest flow of content and users going through it. And anything that gets in the way of that gets in the way of surveillance capitalism, which is capturing information that you can monetize. That's the challenge we face. And that is the fundamental societal decision we have to make. You asked me, and I'll come back to it, on the polling. We have seen those numbers go up, but people saying they've lost trust, they said that last year. So it's a degradation every year of trust. It will come to a head at some point. And just like anything, we correct. Will it be a crash and a significant course correction, or can we just kind of shift the ocean liner a little bit in a better direction, is the fundamental question, I think, is of what the next 5 years is about.
That makes for a perfect segue into our next question, which is addressed to Gretchen, but again, I'll open it up to everyone. The question is, we see big tech starting to change its tune, with Facebook flooding our airwaves and TVs with commercials arguing for change to CDA 230. Do you think Congress should be weary of their willingness, assuming they mean the platform's willingness, to engage?
Well, I think we should all feel delighted that Facebook appears to be open to greater regulation. I also don't think it should be up to the, I agree with, it's one of the few things Mark Zuckerberg and I agree on, which is that it shouldn't be up to him to decide how his platform is regulated. I think that Facebook is spending a huge amount of money to try and make sure regulations go the way that they want them to. And I think we need to be very wary of that. Congress needs to be, I mean, Facebook's lobbying budget weekly is larger than ACCO's annual budget. So they're spending an enormous amount of money in Washington, DC, trying to get the results they want. They're having less and less success at this, but I think we should all be encouraged that some of these big firms are acknowledging that that change is coming down the pipeline. They're going to have to accept it. Obviously, they're going to try and steer how that change goes. Any industry would, but especially a powerful, wealthy one like the tech industry.
Tom or Tim, would you like to comment on that?
Just very briefly, great. Let's have that discussion. Let's not make sure it's not done in a way that creates barriers to entry to competition, because that can happen. If we create an onerous system, then it makes it easier for Facebook to make sure that their competition can't take hold. So the devil's in the details. I take at face value their beliefs, and I hold that. I hope it's true, and I think that can have a good outcome, but just have to make sure that it doesn't stifle competition.
And I would just add that, you know, in the past, we've had a lot of different initiatives from Facebook about cleaning up platforms, things like that. But it's really hard to get to the transparency of what the results are. And so, you know, I hope that this will lead to some dialogue around what is pragmatic for everyone involved, because these are private companies and they are answer to their shareholders and things like that. There are some privacy issues as well. But, you know, I feel like this is a story we've heard before. So I'd like to see where this dialogue actually moves us, and more quickly than slowly, because I think COVID has actually exacerbated a lot of the issues we're talking about right now.
Okay, we are moving through the questions very efficiently. The next one is, please address the law of unintended consequences we see with First Amendment issues. ACLU wrote an open letter to Congress regarding the unintended consequences of the sex trafficking update to 230. Apparently, the language required sex worker forums that were created to help each other with health and safety issues to shut down, potentially removing a valuable tool that should not be considered illegal. I'll open the floor to anyone who wants to go first.
I mean, I'm happy to answer the part of that question, which is that I don't see any reason why a sex worker forum would need to be shut down under the provisions of FOSTA SESTA. I think another fear, one of the concerns that you hear routinely from folks in the tech industry is that revising Section 230 will cause a flood of litigation. The recent study that has come out done by the US government to look into this issue shows that it actually hasn't been used in more than a handful of cases. So it hasn't caused a flood of litigation that's crippling the firms. Will tech companies reduce their exposure to potential sex trafficking? Sure, but I think one of the things that we need to start looking at is reforming our laws around the sex trade. Section 230 is a law about platform liability. It's not about sex work. So if we need to fix those laws, let's fix those laws and make sex work safer for sex workers.
And if I could just add a comment as well, I think that this is something we often hear from the platform sometimes, is that, you know, if there's some, you know, if the liability is lifted, then there's a lot of good content that will go away. So for example, in the health space, when you're promoting health promotion related to substance use disorder or trying to reduce stigmatization, that somehow this will stifle that conversation. A lot of the stuff we look at is pretty simple. like it's illegal content online. And so we have a project that we're working on with the University of San Diego, where we're looking at sex trafficking, specific sites, very specific sites, very explicit about what you're filtering for, what the reviews are about. There's no ambiguity about what's being discussed there. Is there some content that may relate to victims trying to find resources and help from other online users? It's not a platform that does that. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that you can't separate this type of content. Personally, as a public health person, I don't want to be chasing around illegal stuff and fake products online. I want to be doing health promotion. I want to be doing things and promoting messages that will hopefully help and promote people's health versus chasing around bad stuff. That's what I'd rather do. But the unfortunate fact is I think we have a lot of this bad stuff online. And I do think it's very possible, particularly with machine learning and particularly with topic modeling, to separate this content out. And I second Gretchen's comment that if we do want to get specific about opioids, sex trafficking, wildlife trafficking, let's do that in specific legislation that relates to online and offline harm, and not worry about the blanket component, which is liability protection.
The only thing I'd add is laws get amended, and that law went into effect because there was a need. If it's having an unintended consequence, it's legitimate and it's proves true, we'll change it. But that's the whole point of this conversation, which is we're looking at how we continue to evolve our laws and our regulations and our norms so that we have the most healthy and vibrant society we can have. If this is legitimate, we should change it, and just like we should make other changes to it. But I think it has to be legitimate.
Next question, and maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. The question is, we saw recently with Facebook's changes to data privacy, a lot of small businesses and sellers took a hit since they rely so heavily on these algorithms. What would you say to those who argue that addressing these issues of surveillance capitalism will result in diminished commerce and business for small and local businesses that rely on these ads for their success? And again, Tom, we'll start with you.
Sure. It's a legitimate question that we need to look at, but there are many sides to this. I'm going to butcher the company, but there was I think it's called American Mattress based in Cleveland. And if you search for that on Google, specifically American Mattress in Cleveland, you will get about, by the way, the algorithm will always be different based on where you are. So let's just caveat it there. But when I've done that across the board in areas and you search for American Mattress in Cleveland, you will get 7 or multiple examples of companies that have paid money for ads to appear before that. And that is largely because Google is a advertising engine at this point and not a search engine. And so that hurts the smaller companies that are trying to compete with large, well-known national brands. So there's an instance where the system is actually not working well for small businesses because they can't compete. It's no longer about search. It's about who has the most money to show up first. So there are a lot of issues with small businesses that we need to look at as we have the societal debate. That's one of them. We should look at what's going on with Facebook there and come up with a practical, reasonable solutions that make sure that we have good competition. It doesn't stifle competition, both at the small business level. So it's a legitimate question, but it's complicated, and it moves beyond just what's going on with privacy settings. It goes into whether or not those who have the most money can essentially edge out those, even when the search is really specific to a company.
Gretchen or Tim, any further thoughts?
We at ACCO look at illicit content, and we kind of focus on that exclusively. So I have less to say about issues related to algorithms and small businesses. However, I will say that Facebook in particular there's a very interesting case making its way through the courts in California, in which Facebook has been accused of estimation overreach of the size of its market. So to follow up on what Tom said, in as many cases as you can find of small businesses who feel they'll be harmed by the changes to data privacy that Apple is implementing, there are a lot of businesses who small businesses that say they've been harmed by social media, either through fake reviews or problems with data around advertising.
And I would just add that for us, we're not looking at ads either. We're looking at publicly available posts, people basically marketing their services in a very open way and using network systems to proliferate their content.
And by the way, just because I wanted to double check my anecdote, I was trying to remember, I just did American Mattress in Cleveland, and it was the 4th result. So if I'm searching specifically for a company, why am I not getting that search result? Why am I getting 3 or 4 entities on top of it? The reason is because the person who pays the most gets it, which means Google's no longer a search engine. It's a find engine based on advertising. And that's inherently anti-competitive for small businesses.
Somewhat related to that very point, the next question is, things like search and social media benefit hugely from network effects. That makes them winner-take-all markets. How can we have competition and quality products in markets which exhibit network effects? And I'll maybe add or use my moderator's prerogative to maybe add a little bit to this question, given that antitrust was mentioned earlier and of course has been in the news a lot. My sense from the panel is that you see sort of 230 as separate from antitrust. And even if we had a lot more providers, we would still need to resolve the issue to deal with these harms. But I want to throw that out to the panel to potentially discuss the interaction between 230 and antitrust, as these have sort of emerged as major policy issues right now. And maybe I'll start with Gretchen this time.
Again, we at ACCO, we don't specifically work on antitrust issues. I do think that anecdotally, we have seen that smaller platforms are more responsive to the issues of crime, toxic content, and other harms their platforms spread. They seem to respond more quickly, and so that to me is always an argument for breaking up the bigger firms. I think the great argument can be made for the idea that Facebook and Google are too big to care. However, that being said, I think our focus is on getting reform to Section 230 and having that reform play out in a way that it doesn't disadvantage smaller companies and make it harder for new entrants to the market to come in.
And I would just add that looking at the internet in a monolithic view, even if you're kind of stratifying for internet search, social media, and ISP providers or something else, or even the dark web, which is a separate, we're not talking about that because those are not companies, that's pretty hard to do because each platform has its own unique feature set and its own unique form of engagement. So kind of the impact of how these platforms can facilitate illegal content is different per platform. And some features facilitate more or less. There's some cross-platform activity that goes on. A lot of our drug dealers are posting on multiple platforms. So, to say it is very hard to kind of, I don't know how to characterize just a whole monolithic group of social media companies. Actually, I think that regulation should be somewhat adaptive and also be, open-ended to a certain extent because new platforms are going to emerge, and that's great. New ways of communication, new ways of interaction are going to be important in the future. But they are going to have those same vulnerabilities that legacy platforms had or more larger platforms had. So we don't want to stifle the innovation of having platforms that enable more meaningful engagement and more social interaction. But at the same time, we need to recognize that there needs to be adaptability in regulation to address the vulnerabilities that are now and coming in the future.
Yeah, the only thing, and I'll be quick on this, is laws and regulations have a tendency to be about behavior, and antitrust tends to be about structure. So there's structural issues there. So they're very different. But going back to the question, which is about network effect, behavior has an implication there, and particularly antitrust has an implication there, which is there going to be a competitor to Google or Facebook if a VC won't fund them because they tried that 3 times, or because they are afraid they won't be able to use the Android operating system and it makes it impossible to enter a market? And if those are the case, then you actually accelerate the network effect and you never get viable competition. And that creates other challenges. Gretchen put it, too big to care. If there's competitors, then the need for Section 230, which is there no matter what, becomes even more prevailing if there's not competition because they're the only game in town. So that's where the issue of structural issues and behavioral issues start to intertwine.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. The next one we have is, and this may be a short one potentially, but what are tech companies doing to support victims who fall prey to crime online?
I can take that to start with. We had a compelling panel on Tuesday for hosting 3 ordinary Americans who were fighting to get justice for after being harmed online. We heard from Matthew Herrick, who is the plaintiff in Herrick v. Grindr, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court and kept getting thrown out on Section 230 grounds. Matthews had an ex who stole his identity using photos of him to set up fake accounts, asking for men to come over and rape him, saying he had a rape fantasy. He was getting attacked in some cases multiple times a day by people outside of his home and his workplace. The person used, essentially weaponized Grindr's geolocating tools to spoof it being Matthew. He was unable to get Grindr to take down those accounts that used his picture, his name, his address to send people to his home to attack him. That's a shocking interpretation of Section 230 if you consider the intent that Congress had for that law. We heard from Jaime Puerta, who lost his 16-year-old son a year ago to a fentanyl pill that he bought on Snapchat. Snapchat has recently met with a group of parents who lost children to fentanyl pills. These children aren't overdosing. They are being poisoned by very, very dangerous pills that are being sold or marketed as if they are actual pharmaceuticals that are being sold simply without a prescription. Snapchat told the parents that they weren't able to do anything about this problem. My opinion, they'd get a lot faster at it if there was a law passed saying that they were going to be fined millions of dollars every time somebody died or every time a piece of content was found every time a drug dealer was found operating on their platform. I think they'd get a lot faster at it. So would Instagram. We also heard from Catherine Dean, a former federal criminal investigator who was harmed as a result of a fake review online, who single-handedly uncovered this incredible world of fake review fraud that is hosted mainly in Facebook groups, but pumps fake reviews about doctors, about lawyers, about home contractors out onto Yelp, Google, and a host of other platforms. We have seen, we have also been tracking a number of court cases where the platforms are on the one hand, publicly telling people that they care about removing illicit content from their platforms, testifying in Congress that their AI is removing 99% of terror content or 99% of human traffickers. And yet in the courtroom, their attorneys are arguing. I'll give you an example of a Facebook case. Facebook goes into Congress and argues that, or claims that they really care about human trafficking. In a Texas courtroom, Facebook's lawyers argues that a girl who was trafficked, who was recruited by a sex trafficker on Instagram and then sold across a Facebook group, is not allowed to sue Facebook in a Texas court because when she signed the user agreement to use Instagram, she agreed to non-binding arbitration in California. So they're trying to get the case dismissed on those grounds. So I think these firms are really talking out of two sides of their mouths, and we really need to expose some of the legal tactics that they're using and compare them to what they're saying in Congress and to their investors.
I want to let Tim and Tom weigh in on that issue, but we're low on time, so I'm going to insert one final question in there and give you the choice as to what you'd like to address. The question is, we see that Facebook and Twitter often cite that their moderation falls victim to an issue of scale. How do you cope with the scale problem? Tim.
Yeah, I'd just say that when it comes to certain content, scale is not an issue. A lot of, for example, I'll talk about our drug dealers and even our COVID sellers. They're looking to sell stuff. Like, it's actually relatively competitive out there. We did a study about 5-6 years ago where we tried to mimic what an online pharmacy selling drugs would look like on Facebook and multiple social media platforms. It's too tough of a business. I can't stay in business if I don't have ads, if I don't have, ways to do SEO, SEM. I'm not actually selling product. It's competitive out there. So these sellers are actively competing in this space. So in that sense, it's not that hard to detect them relative to other content that's arguably much harder to detect, like, speech issues, cyberbullying, things like that. So I don't think that scale is an issue. I do think that one blank spot for a lot of these platforms is sometimes they only care about what's going on something that they own or something that they control. And they're not concerned about how their platform is being referenced in other forums to sell drugs as well. So we have a lot of problems. Like, we have a lot of actors, we have a lot of people involved, but again, this coordination issue is one of the main issues. You can't get to scale until you coordinate either to address the problem.
Tom, last word. And you're on mute, sorry.
Well, good, because I said speechless, which literally meant I was accurate there. Google made $18 billion in net income last quarter. So the idea of scale, we can't afford it? Our brilliance in algorithms and being able to identify problems isn't good enough? This is a company that can do just about anything that they put their mind to. So the idea that somehow there's a gap or a limit or a resource issue, I can't use the word I want to use. I'll just say speechless.
I want to second what Tom says. The three of our organization, Tim's, Tom's, and mine, make a fraction of the amount of money. I mean, it's a rounding error for these tech firms of what they're putting away in profits every single month, every single quarter. And we're able to go out every single day and document criminals operating online, and so can they.
Well, thank you, everyone. And on that bracing note, perhaps, that brings us to the end of today's event. Please tune in for the final panel on Tuesday, June 29th at 3 p.m. David Dian, editor of the American Prospect, will moderate two leading thinkers on Section 230 reform. University of Virginia Law School professor and MacArthur Fellow Danielle Citrone, and Neil Fried, the founder of Digital Frontiers Advocacy. It's sure to be a great conversation. Thanks again, and we hope to continue this discussion.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Julius.
Thank you, Julius.